The mountain was breathing. Not the alpine sigh tourists post on weekends, but the deep, damp breath of earth that has drunk too much and cannot hold its shape. Somewhere in the dark above Shimla, water threaded itself through a million pinholes in decomposed granite, found the faults and the old roots, and began to talk in a low, granular whisper. A bell rang from a tin-roofed shrine on a spur. Not appeal, just the nervous tap of metal touching metal as the ground forgot to be still. Down on the ridge where the State Emergency Operations Center keeps its lights on through bad seasons, Neela Verma watched the Doppler feed strobe in colors that meant math. The beam from the new radar at Kufri was catching a mass of water climbing the ridge like a tide in the sky. The bulletin on her screen was not new red alert for very heavy to extremely heavy rainfall, but the way the echo blossomed. Right over the old slope, failures made her thumb ache where she held her pen. "This cell is anchoring," she murmured. Not to the room so much as to the mountain. Anchoring meant a cloudburst that sits and pours. A knife of water on a hillside already scabbed and tender from weeks of monsoon. On NH5 above Nigalsari, where the road was bitten into the slope like a patient cut, Raghav Thakur walked with a torch and a junior engineer and listened to rock. He had learned to hear it. The hollow thunk, where a wedge was loosening. The papery crumble of a layer that would become a slope failure if trucks ignored the warnings. And brakeman thought physics could be negotiated. He'd been one of the first on the scene in 2021. When a bus and trucks were taken by a hillside that decided its angle of repose was a joke, and he still carried a rosary from someone's pocket, found later in silt. Tonight, the culverts were burping chocolate water. The muck piles from last winter's whitening works he had argued to move them, to plant them to cradle them under nets were, slicked into a single ugly line above the Sutlej. Up valley in Kannar, in a village that wore its orchards like a shawl. Rahu knocked his boot against the board of a crate and tested an apple with the same fingers he used to feed his son. The fruit blushed nicely this year, but he had noticed the bloom climbing. The old trees at 1,800 meters tired. The new saplings at 2,200 meters pleased. The rumor of farmers pushing into higher, colder villages like a whisper that would become a fact. He'd heard the story too many times to treat it as a curiosity. Snow lines creeping upslope, chill hours falling, apricot and pomegranate where apple had been, orchards that used to sleep under winter, now stirring uneasily. He looked toward the river, where a sudden white rose showed wherever a rock split the current, and pulled a tarp tighter over his stacked boxers. The road to market had been a taking of turns even on dry days. On nights like this, it was a dare. Beyond Ott, in the Beas Valley, tourists played at thunder counting the seconds. To show they were not afraid. Rain hissed on pine needles and sheeted off new roofs in Nagar and Manali. Water finding faster ways downhill on plots where the old trees had been. A hydropower control room at Nathpa Jakri lit its panel in steady, reassuring green while Ard, who had memorized the sound of spillway gates in his bones, watched inflows tick upward with the performative modesty of numbers that will soon shout. Silt sensors trembled in their channels. When the Sutlej ran brown with Himalayan flour, blades ate mountains faster than men with hammers, and decisions about opening gates became ethics as much as mechanics. Up in Keelong, where the Atal Tunnel now stitched a winter of snowbound months into a different kind of year, Nurse Doma counted sutures and listened to the roofs speak at night when the rain came as if the sky had learned new habits. The Hao had been a white silence most of her life. Now the monsoon entered through a man-made hole in a ridge, and the valley learned flash flood vocabulary. Cloudburst, debris flow, armored culvert, alignment. She had walked to a small gompa after a patient stabilized and found the prayer flags pulling themselves taut as if trying to keep the slope together. On the ridge in Shimla, tin roofs flicked with nervous fingers. The old drains that the British cut into the hill when they laid their summer capital had taught water paths it still loved, and the new concrete, poured in a hurry to pin new dreams to old rock, offered fewer ways through. Neela watched a radar pixel bloom to crimson. The bulletin she drafted before midnight felt like a letter she had to write too often. Avoid slope cuts and riverbanks, move from foot of cliffs, do not park under retaining walls, stay away from bridges and nala. She chose the verbs carefully. She knew how it sounded to ask people not to live where they had already built a life. The Sutlej, born in Tibet, to a lake that had once turned into a catastrophe. 2005, when a landslide dam burst and a tide of slate-colored water screamed down into Canarded not rush yet. It thickened, down near the confluence at Sanj, where the poverty liked to carry entire monsoons in her arms. The light over Mandy was a flat lid. In the bazaar, a shopkeeper pushed sacks of grain onto a wooden pallet and refused to worry about the water that licked at his threshold like a dog that wants to come in. He had seen half a dozen worse in decades in the last 10 years. Raghav's torch picked out a wet seam in the slope above a hairpin. He leaned, put his palm to the face, felt the skin crawl cool of waterlogged rock. He wrote on his pad. Weephole clogged. He wanted a backhoe. He had a shovel. I wanted time. Rain. A truck horn sounded far below, too cheerful for the hour. He thought of the 2013 floods in the next state, of roads peeled from mountains like tapes, of how the words Chardam had become an argument about what roads owed to hills, and what hills would refuse to owe anyone. The junior engineer asked, "Sir," as if Raghov were a weather god. In a one-room house above Summerhill, the family who sang on Mondays had lit incense out of habit. The little shrine had a tin roof that made rain into a medium of music. Outside, the slope held a memory of cuts first, a footpath, then a drainage trench, then a terrace that wanted to be a foundation. Someone had buried a pipe. Someone had pulled a tree. Someone had dropped a broken retaining wall stone into a channel because it looked like tidy work. The hillside made a note of each kindness. The first coughs began just before 1 in the morning. A culvert choked and spat. A seam widened. The water changed its mind about which way was down. At Kufri, the radar drew a red bruise over the ridge and refused to move it. In the control room on the Sutlej, a buzzer that never buzzed outside drills gave a short, impolite sound. Inflows, Arjun said to the empty hallway, and reached for the phone list he had rehearsed. In Kannar, Raju woke his son, not in panic, but with the calm of a father who knows the difference between a river behaving and a river getting ideas. "We will go up a little," he said, and the boy asked whether the apples would stay. "The apples will learn to swim if they must," Raju said, and smiled so the boy would. Neela hid SEND on an SMEs that would wake phones along the Beas and the Sutlej, and in the riddled gullies where houses had been grafted to slope by hope and remittance money. The message slid into towers that would keep their signal until a tree or a wall took them. Outside her window, night turned heavier. A dog barked at the wrong thing. Above the little shrine, the mountain took another wet breath. A tin bell chimed, as if to answer a question no one had asked. Then the noise came, the sound every hill person knows in their gut even if they have never heard it. Not the clatter of rock, not yet, but the deep, patient tearing of soil deciding it will let go. The lights went out in a lane down the ridge. In the Beas Valley, an old bridge shuddered. On the control room panel, a red light insisted. And above the shrine, where the rain made a curtain of threads, the hillside flexed, and the ground began to move. It did not begin with a roar. It began with a slow, viscous slide that turned stone to pulp and stairs 2 lines erased. Then the surface tension broke, and the hill found speed. Clay and boulders, and the memories of trees taken for views rushed together, and the tin roof of the shrine lifted like the lip of a book. Voices turned to a single vow. The lane below filled with the smell of raw earth, the way a room fills with bleach. Neela's phone jumped in her hand. A call from a number she knew only as Temple Road Ward officer. She answered into a storm, caught one word collapse and reached for the protocol sheet that would make sense of names and coordinates when nothing else would. On N H5. Raghav heard the mountain cough and knew where to look before his torch found the wrinkle in the slope bulging like a pocket. "Stop traffic," he said, and the junior engineer ran with a handheld lamp that turned rain to spears. 2 trucks gunned their engines as if an extra 300 horsepower could argue with gravity. Raghav planted himself in the lane with his palms up. He had learned to make his body a barrier long before the barricades arrived. Stones knocked and darted like fish around his boots. A pink plastic sandal shot out of the darkness and settled against the white line like a strange, small coin. In the control room at Nathbajakri, Arjun read the Sutleja's new mood on a strip chart that hopped from concern to consequence. Silt concentration soared. He tasted the word in his mouth, brationed and picked up the direct line to the district magistrate downstream. "We will have to open," he said. "It will be controlled, but it will be more. Warning sirens, please, 10 minutes. He hated the phrase controlled release, because he knew what it looked like in a village on a floodplain. It looked like a river that had made up its mind. At aught, the bees remembered it was a mountain river with a short temper. Shops that had been polite guests on its banks for a decade learned the lease terms were not in their favor. A row of scooters fought to float and then gave in. The smell turned from pine and wet dust to diesel, to cumin from a wet bag of spices, to cold metal, to fear. The old ion of the bridge groaned as the river leaned its shoulder into the piers and pushed. In Kilong Dolmas, phone lit with a message from the district. Cloudburst reports, near Utakipur side. Bridges out. Stay put. Prepare for road isolation. She walked the ward with the steady insistence of a metronome. Counted who could be moved if one building had to be abandoned. Checked the generator. Checked the backup. To the backup. She remembered the 2021 night when a summer cloud broke like a jug, when the Chinook turned brown in a single breath, and the road scabbed away in 5 places. The new tunnel had turned the valley into a corridor without the old winter silence. The monsoon now walked up it like a guest who had found a key under the mat. Ryu and his boys stood above their orchard, as small, bright things began to lift arps. Tools, the lid of a crate. The terraces stayed, cut by grandfathers who had understood water, but where a neighbor had carved a house pad into a hollow and filled it with good earth. The earth now remembered it had been a channel and took that shape again. A new concrete facade, slumped like a tired face. The apple trees shrugged water with the indifference of trees. Their roots did sums very differently than men, and never lied. Ryu's wife asked about the goats. "The goats are smart," he said, "smarter than us." He tied them to a walnut trunk and put his hand on the bark like a promise. In Mandi, the market road became a brown glossary of loss. Spices, tea, ironmongery, a bright cascade from a sack of chili, temple flowers that did not care whose god they had been meant for. Shopkeepers stood on counters. One man, waist deep in the bees, held on to a shutter and shouted a list my papers, my tools, my mother's ring, my son, until his voice turned into the sound of rain and he stopped speaking at all. The siren downstream of Nathpajokri did exactly what a siren is supposed to do. It turned the hairs on the back of a neck into antennae. It made people think of school drills and of the day in 2005 when a pulse from a Tibetan lake had slipped past sensors and human expectations and dragged bridges into the subtle edge like toys. Arjun gave the signal, and the gate rose a measured, obedient amount. The river's voice deepened. "Hold it," he said, chin to chest, as if the water needed human permission to keep its shape. Siak to DDMAs. Confer. Triggers. Neela read into her headset. Ward-level quick response teams move to ward-reported collapses. Avoid secondary slope failures. Manages Linestempel Road. Samahildu not crowd. Her screen filled with dots and numbers, and the way that soft words stand in for hard things. She could not see the faces in that lane. She knew from years of drill that the first hour would be decision and sweat and shouting and an inventory of tools whose absence would make itself known like a pain. The rain was not just rain. Any forester in the Himachal would have told you the hills were young, still lifting, still cracking where subducting plates rubbed like teeth. Any farmer who had watched a hillside since childhood would have said we cut too hard, too straight, widened roads with vertical cuts rather than benches, filled ravines with muck where we should have knitted them with grass and bamboo and wickerwork of willows. The weatherman palette scientists in offices at the India Meteorological Department had given the new thing a name in their steady way. Monsoon-western disturbance interaction. 2 wet systems tugged at each other, and the price was paid here. A Himachal road transport bus nosed toward a bridge over a nala that had yesterday been clear enough to count stones, and today puffed brown like a bull. The driver, a a woman from Kosog, who had learned this route as a girl, judged the scouring eyes at the base of the pier and feathered her throttle so that her wheels would not spin. Passengers gripped the seats not because of the water, but because they now understood how much of their day was held together by 100 small assumptions. That the ground was ground, that a line on a map was a road, that a mountain would stay where it had been. A boulder the size of a calf rolled down into the stream with the heavy grace of a thing that does not care who watches. Ragov got his closer. The police jeep finally nosed across, its blue light a ridiculous jewelry in the brown night. He planted cones that would be gone in 20 minutes and watched the seam tear. It was almost beautiful, the way a failure can be when it is clean. A wedge sliding along the bed of an old plane, the signatures of hornfuls and schist, reading like a book torn in half. He thought of the manual on his shelf, with its photographs of wedge failures and topples and slides, the neatness of pattern against the chaos of weather. In Kilongdolma walked a man from a bed to a chair, and back again until his breath remembered itself. "We will be fine," she said, and he looked at her as if to remind her that this was not a medical diagnosis. She had a list in her pocket of phone numbers for a mess that spanned 4 valleys. She had learned to stage 4 poles so that they could be grabbed in the dark. She had learned to forget about the big questions until the little ones, the only ones that are actually big, the ones where a person is breathing or not, wary answered. At the control room, Arjun watched the silt content spike again, the brown in the river turning to concrete, and ordered a trim of generation, a haircut on the whole northern grid's power supply. Somewhere, lights went out, not because of a snapped wire, but because water and rock had made electricity a bad idea for a while. It is always that. For a while that saves machines and loses patience. In the lane above Shimla, men and women dug with shovels that looked like toys, with hands that remembered fields, with the sort of steel that comes from unrelenting, unglamorous labor. They made human chains, possessed stones, listened hard for the small sounds that mean a person might be breathing in a pocket of air. The rain made a curtain that cut the beam of every torch in half. Someone shouted a name and then another. A wall leaned. Someone said, "Stop," and they all did, because in the hills you learn that the second failure is the one that punishes bravery. Neela typed cloudbursts suspected over Shimla Ridge, multiple landslides, and sent it to people who would be standing in mud in 5 minutes. She copied in the chief engineer at PWD and the home secretary, and then sent a message that had become almost normal in the last 2 monsoons. All travel on Beas, Sutlej, Chenab corridors discouraged. Road widening work to suspend. No muck dumping. Audio advisories to play. She stared at the last clause, one that had taken a year of political chewing to write, and felt something like anger and something like prayer. The Bees leaned into Mandy with the patient intent of a carpenter planing a board. The river had time. People did not. A hoarding tore free and cartwheeled into the water, a famous face for an instant more surprised than its owner had ever been. In Kinnar, 100 miniature waterfalls braided a cliff and then found a path they liked better, down through an orchard where the terraces had been cut to square, into a neighbor's kitchen. In Lahal, a culvert that had been designed for 5-year rain coughed up stones the size of cabinets and quit. In Shimla, the little bell that had been ringing was somewhere under 10 feet of a mountain that had moved its small voice, now a memory. At the bus on the little bridge, a log struck the downstream girder, and the whole structure thrummed. The driver felt the wheel lighten, and eloquent warning end slid into reverse, even as her mind did the calculus of humans on either bank and the slope above. The tires spun in fine silt. A passenger whispered a god name. The bridge gave a sound like a ship's plank. The Bees made its case, not in words but in brown, and up in the control room, under the hum that reminded him of the first year he learned the names of the gates, Arjun watched the orange needle climb one last notch and reached for the lever. The moment when a system stops pretending is quiet. The bridge did not so much break as make a choice. It unpinned itself from one abutment and took a small step downstream, still upright, one end held by concrete, the other submitting to the anger of a river. The bus rocked, slid sideways, kissed the rail, and stopped with its nose facing a wall of rain. For a second, everything held its breath. Then the passengers began to move, a honeycomb of bodies, toward a door that had been ordinary until it was not. Rogev shouted into his radio that the breach above NH5 was active and that he was closing both lanes. He did the thing he hated most in his job. He stood and watched as a massive hillside moved, because to touch it would be to die. He counted seconds between rumbles to see if there was a pattern he could use. His hand found his pocket and the rosary bead inside, a habit he had not decided to have. He marked the toe of the slide with a stake for a surveyor who was not coming tonight. Mandy drank the road. Shops gave up on the ground floor and went upstairs. And then the upstairs became a bridge to a roof. And then the roof was a platform that creaked with the weight of humans. The old temple across the river, which had watched small disasters with the calm of a dozen centuries, was up to its plinth. Lights went out one by one on a block of rooms where tourists had been calculating whether they could check out early and move to a drier town. The hydropower plant heard the river in its bones. Turbines are elegant machines for tamed water. They are bad company when a river arrives with machetes and grit. Arjun reduced generation and opened the gate another degree. The number is small on a console and the change inignorable in the throat of a valley. Downstream, a white line appeared on the brown mouth of the river, a lip of froth drawn by gravity and metal. People heard the pitch lift, and even those who had not grown up by water recognized the way a river can sing a warning. In Keelung, the sky could not decide if it wanted to be gray or something darker. Dolma and two ward boys laid out an improvised triage with Tapa things she had seen on the news and other disasters. Somewhere far away and tropical, something she had secretly thought would never be relevant in a place whose disasters had always been avalanches and loneliness. Now the loneliness had been replaced by an abundance of road, and with it came a different abundance. Rayu's neighbor's house slumped with the weary grace of a tired animal. The front room became a carpeted river. A portrait floated toward the door and bumped the frame as if asking for permission to leave. He and the boy picked up what they could: the ledger, a bag of seed, the old radio that had outlasted 3 governments. The boy asked, "Will the road be open tomorrow?" in the same voice he used to ask if school was off. Rayud imagined the hairpin above Topri, the undercutting where the rivers seemed to have learned mischief from children, and shook his head. The lane where the tin-roofed shrine had stood became a churn of bodies and streams that found new channels around boots and ankles. Mud past the shins. Someone said the word pocket, and everyone fell silent. They listened with their whole bodies for a thump that could be a heartbeat. The rain wrote furious lines on the backs of their necks. Someone started to dig with a broken piece of a door, hands moving in a rhythm older than the state. Neela thought of maps. She saw, in her mind's theater of contour lines, the hazard zonation papers that had mapped exactly this ridge as a place where a slope had failed a century ago and would likely do so again under saturation. She had been at a meeting where a builder had called the maps advisory. The word advisory now felt like an insult to gravity. She sent a message to the IMD office to request a sounding on the persistence of the cloud mass. Continues. Came back like a sentence without subject or object. As brutal as any weather verb can be. The bees at Mandy pulled at the banks as if looking for a zipper. The old stone gods, dressed in river for centuries, took the insult with the dignity of old stone. The newer concrete gave way with a flounce of rebar. A man on a roof lit a cigarette with hands that shook and said to no one, "It will go down," because he had to say something to justify not jumping into the brown and making his children learn to be brave. A dog came to stand on his feet and put its head against his shin. A warm insistence that kept his legs attached to the idea of standing. Arjun watched a screen that measured what's in a river and felt the urge to walk down to the spillway gallery to see it with his eyes. He did not, because the rule was the rule. You cannot be curious where the water decides to be the teacher. He called the plant's instrument engineer and asked for the numbers in an hour. "If we keep this up," he said, "we save the runners. If we don't, we change them in 6 months. If we don't open gates, we lose the plant in an afternoon." The man on the other end said yes, and the way that meant I will do this hard thing now and hate you later. Phone videos flew like swallows between valleys, a retaining wall buckling in sullen, a bus spitting out of a brown mouth of water in Kul. A line of cars reversing in one long ballet on the Shimla highway, the tired face of a municipal worker sitting on a pile of sandbags, and looking like a soldier at the end of a shift that had not started or ended in a week. The comments were the same in every language. A god name, a curse, a practical instruction. A wrong instruction. An argument about whether anyone had seen this before. An argument about whether climate change was a word that belonged in this place. Each hillside made its own case. Some held, because the pine roots were still threaded like old lace. Some slid a little and then stopped, and asked for mercy in the form of woven grass and bamboo, and a ditch cleared of the plastic bags that had been too convenient to carry groceries, into inconvenient to think about twice. Some let go all at once. Years of tiny frictions letting loose like a room filled with whispers that suddenly agreed to say the same thing aloud. In Keelung, the thud of a helicopter came and went up valley. Doma knew it would land when the ceiling lifted and not a minute before, and that until then the road was a rumor. She laid hands on a woman's arm and felt a pulse that was strong, quick. She spoke into that steady river of muscle, as if it were a person she could reason with. The way mountain people have always spoken to natural forces, not because it changed the forces, but because it reminded the speaker of who they were. In Shimla, someone found a wrist. He did not shout. He said the name quietly and felt for a pulse that answered. A small answer. The human chain bent around the point like a river around a rock. The shovel work turned to finger work. A line of men held their bodies against a lean in the bank to keep it from thinking it could break again. There is nothing as elegant as a chain of villagers moving earth. No machine cares about the tiny difference between a suffocating foot and a breathing mouth. No machine can feel when a slope is about to shrug. At the hydropower plant, the white water from the gate wrote a new stripe on the valley wall. It would be remembered as a number in a file and a photograph in a newspaper and a lesson in a conference next winter. Tonight, it was a choice that kept a blade from ripping its skin off. Arjan took no comfort in the calculus. He thought of the village below, where a man would say, "The dam flooded us," and he would nod because it was true enough, and also not the whole truth. Rahul looked at his orchard and thought of his grandfather with his habit of arguing with rain. He had laughed at that as a boy. He had learned to do it himself as a man. He whispered something rude at the clouds, and then something soft. The boy at his side watched his father becoming a person who spoke to weather and thought this was a skill he might also need. Behind them, the neighbor's front room sighed in a way that made Raju look away. He would come back after the rain, with a rope and a promise. The bus on the half-bridge spilled people to the abutment. In a dance that was somehow orderly, the driver kept her eyes on the upstream. She measured logs with her mind. She put a hand on the horn to call to a man on a scooter who thought his machine could edge past. She shook her head hard, and the man turned, and his face, for a second, wore a shame he would later translate into anger. In a minute he would tell a group of men at a tea stall that the government had never done anything for him, and he would be right and wrong in equal measure. Someone cried out in the Shimla lane, a sound with no words in it at first, and then a name, and then more names. The list like a prayer. The chain bent. A small hand, gray with silt, came free of the earth. It opened, closed. The men made a tunnel with their bodies, and a child came out into rain that felt like mercy and needled both. The child coughed once in a way that cut every throat on that slope. For a second, the mountain was not a disaster but a room with a baby in it. And then, because this was not a story that would allow relief to be simple, the slope above groaned, a fresh seam tearing, and the line of men felt the tremor travel through the earth into their toes. They leaned harder into the bank. They reminded it. It was part of them. Not their enemy. They felt it consider. It was the saturation that turned into a personality. Every pebble was wearing a sheath of water. Every blade of grass had given up its grip on the thin skin of soil it held. The rain did not so much fall as exist around everything, the way fog does on late autumn mornings, except this was heavy, impatient, incalculably busy water. The second cell on Neela's radar married the first and sat like a guest who takes his shoes off and stretches. She called the meteorologist on duty for the Western Himalayan division, a woman with a patient voice and a coffee that had not cooled. Persistence for another 4 hours. Came the verdict. Embedded convection cloudburst criteria in 2 pockets along the ridge. Embedded meant hidden in the general. Cloudburst meant 100 millimeters in an hour or worse. Criteria was a strange word to attach to a sky that wanted to prove it was a mountain too. The decision at the plant that engineers dreaded arrived wearing the same clothes as always. The runner vibration count and the silt density said no. The inflow and the head pond levels said yes. Arjun felt the familiar calm that arrives in a body designed for storms. "Open gate 3 by 2%, he said, and the software asked if he was sure, and he laughed at the politeness of computers. He saw, in his mind, the water curling out from under the gate leaf, the cobblestones below dancing, the men fishing near the old ford who would feel the river change under their calves. He wished his voice could reach them and move them a few meters up a bank. Below, in hamlets that had learned the siren's tone through the season, men banged steel and steel, not for ceremony, but to tell their neighbors that river talk was about to turn to shouting. Old women, who had been through Parku's rage in the long summer floods of previous years, moved small trunks up a step without complaint. Children carried chickens as solemnly as priests carry bells. The smell of hot tea endured under the metallic smell of so much water. In Mandi, the skeleton of a small hotel found itself with one leg in the river. The front desk clerk refused to leave his ledger, then left his ledger because a colleague put her palm on his cheek and made him look at the water as if she were making him look at the face of a child who had dirt herself and needed actual attention rather than the idea of attention. On the ghats, men in shorts and sweaters moved idols inland and apologized to gods as if two friends for the bother. Legov watched a boulder ride a mud tongue across both lanes as gracefully as a cruise ship arriving at a foreign quay. He had never liked the metaphor of landslip. It sounded like a coat falling off a chair. There was nothing cute about a slope failing. He forced the word landslide to be literal in his mouth, a thing he could put between himself and the idea that he could step under that moving world and hold it. He called PWD Control and asked for a drilling team in the morning. "Morning," the voice on the other end said, as if it were a historical era rather than a time of day. They both laughed because they needed to remind each other that tomorrow always existed in these conversations. In Keelong, Doma moved her green tags to a corner of the ward and made room for yellow. It was a ritual as religious as any. She set a nurse to watch a man whose oxygen was drifting. She stared at the door for a second, knowing that somewhere down Valley a road was deciding which tone it would take. A slump, a yawning nick out of a hairpin, an innocuous-seeming puddle that was actually a hole. She sent a message to a friend at the bro yard across the valley. "Any word?" He sent back a photograph of a dozer asleep under a tarp like a faithful animal waiting for a call it already understood. The bus had emptied, and the driver backed it carefully to the abutment as the bridge groaned into a new angle. The sort of sound that makes even unconcerned people suddenly hold their keys tighter. She parked it like a talisman, showing to the mountain that she had finished her part of the old deal between wheels and road. The passengers stood in a litter of rain and shouted thanks into the noise, and some people shouted prayers. And it all sounded the same. Neela looked at a landslide susceptibility map on her second monitor. The colors which had seemed so academic 2 years ago now like a bruise blooming on her own skin. She zoomed into Macleodgang, to Manakaran, to the long strait of the river south of Kulu that had hosted so many dabas that motorists had started calling it a taste of the plains. She drew a ring around a set of coordinates and sent it to the district with a note. Secondary failures likely. Moved dwellings, nearest retaining walls. She did not expect anyone to move, but sometimes, someone did. Ryu watched the river's edge nibble at a toe of his neighbor's land and then stop, as if the bees allowed a kindness for a few beats. He found a spade and cut a shallow ditch above his kitchen where the rain had started to create a shine on the ground that meant infiltration had turned to overland flow. He spoke out loud, in the tone of a man teaching a child to sweep. "Come here, not there." The ditch worked. He felt momentarily like a wizard and then immediately like a fool because he knew that if the river wanted his kitchen, it would have it. Still, he had made a small victory, and that is how all mountain people build their lives. A row of small, defiant wins against geometry. Argun watched the river below the gates. He thought, not of equations now, but of the long season. The winter when run of river. Plants would be thirsty. The spring when snowmelt would trickle politely and repair some things. The late summer when the Atlantic leagues away, thought about hurricanes and the monsoon, took its cues from oceans that had warmed by fractions, that translated here into dramas. It is an odd job to be a doorkeeper to a river. You learn to identify with the latch. In Shimla, The chain of men still leaned into the bank. The second groan made everybody look up, an instinct older than speech. A wife's hand found a husband's sleeve and did not let go. A boy in a school uniform took a step without being told and placed a plank under a sagging corner that had decided to be a slide. Someone shouted, "Move," and the chain moved. A slow, coordinated lateral that would put ballet companies to shame. A chunk of earth slewed down, missed 2 legs by the width of a breath, and thudded into the pile. They stood where they were, together, and breathed with the mountain. The radars screamed soft. Neela saw the echo begin to diffuse at its edges, and refused to trust it. She had been tricked by edges before. She wrote a note to herself to call the hydrology unit at IIT Mandi next week, to ask about pilot projects for landslide early warning. She had heard of sensors shoved into slopes that could squeal when a hillside was liquefying, cheap tilt meters made of tube and ball bearing, and a phone that could call a ward office before the mountain made the call itself. She smiled at the idea of giving a hill a voice that people would respect more because it came as a notification. At the edge of Mandi, where the old road climbed to a row of whitewashed houses, a line of volunteers knocked on doors and told people not to sleep by the wall that faced the slope. Not because the wall cared, but because if it came, it would come without asking. Old men grumbled and then moved their cots, because they recognized in the voice of a young man from their own ward the cadence of an instruction meant to keep a body whole. Regov walked the toe of the slide to see how far it would allow him to go. He saw, by torch, a piece of painted wood that had been a toy. He put it in his pocket just long enough to give it back later to whomever wanted something to hold that connected this night to an ordinary day. He phoned his wife and said, "All right," and she said, "Hun," and they both heard the men around them shouting nonsense and instructions and names, and the rain being itself, endless, ambitious, humble as gravity. Somewhere above, in the dark, another seam wet its way to decision. Somewhere below, in the market, a gas cylinder bumped a pillar and began to leak in a gentle, terrifying whisper. Somewhere, in Kil. The power flicked and returned, and the entire ward exhaled as if it had been holding its breath for the exact length of that heartbeat. They had, somewhere on the Sutlej, a fisherman went to the bank by habit to see what the river had brought him, and then stopped with a toe and froth that was wrong and stepped back without articulating the calculus that had saved him. The rain, stubborn, eased by a syllable. The mountain held its tongue. People tucked the fact of their own breath back into their shirts, as if it were a bill they had almost dropped. The second spell would come, it always does, in a night like this. The aftershock of cloud, but for a slivered hour there was only the hum of a valley trying to sleep underwater that did not know how. Dawn poured thinly over slopes that had changed shape. Clouds hung like curtains with the hem dragged in the mud. In Mandi, the Beas had bled back into its banks, but the banks had moved. A line of silt on walls told a story in centimeters. Men ran a finger along it, marked it with a thumbnail, looked at other men and did not say anything because the number was in their eyes. Saying it aloud would make the math too rude. The lane in Shimla, where the shrine had been, was a hive of men who did not tire, and women who stood by with steaming kettles like a sacrament. There were bhatis, some carried, some wrapped, all of them handled with a tenderness that made one want to cry because the tenderness did not care if anyone was watching. There was the child who had coughed. There were others. When the chief minister arrived, he put on a raincoat and listened to people who did not care about his raincoat, and that, at least, was right. The priests from a temple uphill brought a bell and rang it once, soft, not to announce a god but to say, "We are here, among ourselves." Arjun stood on the gallery and watched the Sutlej do the thing it must always do after a fury. Pretend to be sheepish. The brown lightened a little. The air smelled of ground rock in a way that entered the throat and lay there like powder. He looked at a piece of drift wedged in the riprap, a blue plastic barrel that had likely been a life in someone's courtyard. He thought of letters he had read from men, better than him, with numbers, about change in the cryosphere, up the line. Basins, warming. Glaciers stepping back. Lakes pooling under high moraines. Like secrets, with plots. The next Paretu happening quietly until the hour. It would not be quiet. He went back inside and wrote the night's numbers in a book that had on its first page a phrase in neat script. Decisions made when you can hear the water must be written for days when you cannot. Rahul walked between trees with a broom. a thing to do to make chaos smaller. He righted crates that had floated an inch and had the sense to stop. He checked the ditch he had cut. It was full and working. He felt pride that he allowed himself, because he had not allowed himself fear last night, and this was his reward. The neighbor's house was a new shape. He knocked on a door that had become a piece of wall and called a name quietly, as if he were speaking to someone half asleep. The neighbor answered from higher ground, with a curse and a laugh and a question about tea. They made a plan to rebuild the terrace and to plant willow in the wet place, where the slope kept thinking it was a gully. The plan cost nothing except time and care and attention to old tricks. The men shook hands, and it was a contract more binding than some with stamps. In Mandis market, the old solidarity returned with the smell of dal, from a gurudwara that knows exactly how to turn disaster into a meal. A policeman carried a toddler on his hip while his cap dripped without complaint. A man who sold mobile covers the day before took a broom to a neighbor's floor. The hotel clerk found his ledger 3 houses down, the pages swollen, numbers blurred into a kindness that meant no one had to have a fight today about rents and deposits. A local radio jockey who had called out warnings through the night, like a friend whispering into all the ears in the valley at once. Read names of places that needed diesel for pumps. Neela, who had not slept, watched the rain shift into a mode she trusted more. Showers with breaks, a sky that allowed thought. She sent one last update, and then stared at a blank page in a new document that would become a memo about what to do before the next time. That was also this time, because the mountain was not going to become an older mountain in our lifetimes. She wrote sentences with verbs that mattered. Map, install, enforce, restore. Map the debris fans, and tell the truth about what can be built there. Install cheap, resilient sensors on critical slopes, with a phone number painted on a board below them. The number of a person who answers. Enforce the rules about muck dumping as if they were about explosives. They are restored drains, the boring ditches without which no city, hill or plain, survives. She added a paragraph about people and trees and rocks, about how to treat a pine, not as decoration but as infrastructure. How a willow on a wet toe of slope is not romance, but reinforcement. How grass woven across a cut bank is not pretty but practical, exactly the way a well-placed buttress is. Ati Plantajun wrote down the silt spike in the Gate Times, and then wrote a personal note to a chief engineer who would argue later about generation. Targets over monsoon. A reminder that more plants would be in the wrong place if we kept building them above villages without thinking of what the river would do when it was bored with our lines. He did not expect to win the argument. He intended to be irritating. The only way to change a big system is to be, as someone told him once, a pebble in the shoe of a very large man. Dalma, who was bone-tired, let herself lean against a cold wall for exactly 1 minute. She had lost 3 and saved more. The ward smelled of antiseptic and river. A helicopter thudded down to give her the gift of the sound of blades when she was expecting the gift of supplies. Both were welcome. She thought of the winter 2 years ago when a cornice had broken clean and an avalanche had taken a road like a page torn from a book, and how she had thought then, foolishly, of winter as the season of danger. She smiled at the mountain. It's a lesson plan. She walked to the bed by the window and took a pulse, and wrote a number and tucked a blanket and told a patient from Udaipur that she had eaten no breakfast and would take some now, and the patient scolded her, as she had hoped she would. The ward laughed for the first time in a day. On the line between Buntar and Manikaran, where the Parvati runs like a woman who has too much to do and no patience for anyone in her way, a group of trekkers made vows they would turn into Instagram captions, and then, with luck, into life choices. Not to pitch tents near channels that look dry in October and feral in July. Not to treat old men's warnings as village superstition. Not to throw a bag of chips into a ditch that turns into a drain that turns into a river that turns into a brown line across a life. Blaguv took off his helmet and pushed wet hair back from his forehead with a hand that looked older this week than last. He walked to the lip of the new scar and saw the layering like a cake baked badly. The different tastes of rock and clay and sand that do not belong stacked that way. He stood a moment in the simple grief hills people feel about dirt. He thought of a friend who had moved to a job on the plains because his wife could not bear the sound of rain anymore. He thought of his boy who drew mountains with happy trees and small houses on spurs, and how he would have to teach him to draw with empty places where the mountain needs to breathe. The state announced numbers that could never be the night. Lives lost, houses damaged, kilometers of road affected, crores of rupees in loss. The numbers were real and also beside the point of what it had felt like to put your ear to a slope and hear it talk. The chief minister listed compensation. The opposition argued about drainage policies and tendering for four-laning in the black economy of riverbed mining that had eaten foundations without paying taxes. An old man in a daba said, "They will talk. We will fix." And then he went outside and began clearing the drain at the corner because no one else had yet. A week later, when the air had a new cleanness, and the season allowed the mountain to forget some of what it had just done, a team from the space agency put out a bulletin about a lake and a glacier on the Speedy side that had filled more this year than last. A hydrologist from IIT, Mandy, sent Neela a note about a pilot sensor network in Sirmore that had caught a slope waking up with enough time to move people. A forest guard in Kannar posted photographs of willow fences being woven by women on a toe of slope that used to move every year, and which this year had only sighed. A line worker at the power company showed a photograph of a small community-built check dam that had kept a hairpin from cutting itself free and smiled like a man whose job had been saved by a pile of stones with plants in them. Raju harvested his apples a week late and loaded them onto a truck that would make 2 days in what used to be 6 hours. The boy held the ledger with pride. They ran their hand along the silt line in the kitchen and decided to leave it there like a calendar. On the road down to Rampur, they saw a section where the river had reached up and licked the asphalt from below and a new sign that said "No Halt," and someone had written, with a marker, "No Dump." A joke that was not a joke. The boy laughed and then grew serious. The shrine on the spur was rebuilt as a small platform with a flag open to the sky. A plaque listed names. It did not mention climate change. It did not need to. The men who had dug stood under the flag sometimes and smoked quietly. The women stopped bringing tea because they had decided that the men needed to sit with silence and not be needed every second of a life. Children played near the new drain that had been cut deeper and lined with stone, and they did not know the stone's value, and that was how it should be. They would learn. Neela stood on the lane one morning weeks later, off duty, and watched water run in a place it could live. She felt the plain yes in her chest that comes when something is right without being dramatic. The mountain had not become safer. It had become better understood. That is not comfort so much as competence. We do not tame young rock. We live with Italiano. We will do some things that help ban building on toes and on old slide scars because no geometry will ever forgive those. Even wrapped in concrete, enforce the boring, blessed rules of drainage. Plant where roots can hold and not pretend grass is decoration. Stop feeding rivers, the broken teeth of hills, as muck. Build roads with benches and drains and humility instead of cuts in confidence. Watch the sky with radar and the slopes with wires that whisper. Talk to the people who live with the mountain as if they are experts because they are. We will also, if we are wise, begin to move some things. Schools from slopes, hospitals from floodplains, bridges from shallow foundations into bedrock, people from places that ask too much of them too often. Retreat when the mountain asks for room is not defeat. It is respect. The Himalaya is young and loud. Himachal is its hot zone, where the laboratory of geology and climate writes its notes in landslips and flash floods. And in the steady, ordinary work of men and women making drains and planting willows and sticking a hand into a slope to save a child. A case study is only useful when it is read. The hills do not want they want engineers and nurses and orchardists and children with better drawings. The next night like that night will come. It will be different and the same. We can be different, too. If stories like this move you, subscribe for more true events that change the world.